EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. They say history is a tale told by winners. So who's writing the history textbooks and deciding what students are taught? Those are some of the questions today's guest set out to answer. She is Jana Goldstein, a national correspondent for the New York Times, and she read thousands of pages of middle and high school textbooks for a new project that's spurring a lot of discussion among educators, students, policymakers, and education reporters. Jana, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Hi, Emily. Thanks so much for having me.
So you spent some time in Michigan last year. You were looking at the fight over the question of whether history teachers were accurately describing the U.S. as a democracy, whether that was a fair depiction. Did that provide some of the seeds for this project?
It did. One of my inspirations for this piece was walking into a 8th grade social study classroom in Michigan for that previous reporting. And it was the classroom of a really great, dynamic, thoughtful, smart, engaged teacher. And on her desk was her McGraw-Hill history textbook. And it was all marked up. You know, she had sticky notes sticking out of the pages with notes to herself. She had dog-eared stuff underlined, highlighted. And I realized, after state legislators argue about social study standards, those standards end up in the hall of publishing companies, and those textbooks end up in the hands of teachers, and teachers still do use their textbooks. Textbooks are just one source. Great teachers use many other sources and don't heavily rely on the books. But as teachers go out to find, primary historical evidence or other types of materials to bring into their lessons, these books are guides to them of how to sequence their classes, what themes to hit. And I wanted to really take a look at this process because the private companies that produce textbooks with taxpayer dollars are not terribly transparent about their editorial processes.
What I think is really interesting here is this idea that teachers have to trust the textbook to some degree. And the more that they rely on it, the less they feel like they need to go out and get some extra sources or to switch things up. I mean, there's definitely some kind of a comfort zone that might be created if they have a textbook that they think is fair and reliable. Is that a reasonable way to say that?
I think so. I think almost any good history teacher will know that a textbook is an incomplete document and will look elsewhere as well. But because textbooks now across the country are really geared toward matching state standards, that makes them even more valuable to teachers because those state standards define what is also on, end of course standardized tests in many, many states in American history. So it's sort of all these documents kind of converge on the teacher's desk and give her a pretty strong map of where she needs to go in this class. So each one is very important.
When someone teaches math, there may be different techniques or approaches to that instructional model. For example, what someone might have called new math or maybe something like Singapore math, but ultimately they're still teaching kids that 2 + 2 = 4. Is there a particular kind of fluidity to the content of history that makes this different?
Yeah, I think the content is endlessly fluid. You may do an American history class that focuses heavily on a theme like racial segregation and discrimination, or conversely, you could be in a classroom that focuses very little on that theme. Now, both may be giving students historically accurate information, but the approaches will be limited. So yes, I think there's really no getting around, some of the deep ideological or political questions that are closely connected to the teaching of history.
I've been following some of the Twitter conversations, and there have been many of them about your project. And something that some historians have said that have been echoed by other observers is that they appreciate that you didn't frame this story as politics have invaded the classroom, as though there's one definitive version of history that's supposed to be taught, and that somehow some of the political stances of the people in these states who decide what's in textbooks have interfered with that. How intentional was that?
It was 100% intentional. I don't believe that there should be or is one ideal narrative of American history. Some people came away from my piece saying, well, shouldn't there be, or I wish there could be, but I don't believe that there really can be. And, I'm someone who studied history in school, and I've also written a book of history. So I think I'm sort of intimately familiar with how each editorial choice really can frame the narrative differently. And I think it's natural, normal, and healthy as a society that we have these debates. So yes, the writing of history is inherently political, what we put in, what we leave out. really my goal with this project was to show how, because of this political process and because of the very different, ideological stances of policymakers across the country, students are learning different things in the classroom. And I felt that it was very important to cover this, especially as we head into a presidential election year in 2020.
How quickly did you settle on California and Texas as your comparison states?
It wasn't totally clear to me when I first went to the publishing companies to start to request, and in some cases fight, to be sent these books, that California and Texas would be my examples here. I also have books on my desk from other states, and I have national versions of the books. But it became really clear once I started reviewing the text itself that it would be important to look at these two states. They have very different approaches. Both of these states have recently updated their social studies standards in the past few years. So their books are newer and their tests are newer. And so this can give us a picture of, what it's like in 2020 to be working in this profession of being a social studies teacher, and what's it like to be a student in these classrooms.
So there are state standards for what students will be taught, and most beat reporters have at one time or another sat in on one of these textbook committee meetings. But for folks who are listening who may not understand how it works, who decides in California and Texas and other states what textbook they're going to use and what kind of standards they're holding them to?
Well, let's just take the process a little bit from top to bottom and kind of end in the classroom with the kid holding the book. In California and Texas, a state board of education appoints folks that write social studies standards. And this in and of itself can be a very political process. But once those standards have been written and the document exists, it goes to the textbook publishing companies, and they will sort of adjust the content of their books to meet standards in specific states like California, Texas, Florida. Not every state is big enough to demand their own version of a book, but many states these days have their own versions, not just these 3 states, but these are the 3 biggest. After that, the companies go to the state and they compete to try to get adopted at the state level. And this is a very important process, because if your textbook is not adopted by a state like California or Texas, it may not be a successful product on the marketplace. You want these millions of students to get copies of your book. Once the textbook list of adopted acceptable books has been put out by the state, it is still up to districts, school districts, and schools to decide what books to buy. And in both of these states, in fact, the school district and the school can buy a book that's not on the list. But in practice, I found that doesn't happen very often.
The concept of white flight, of white families leaving communities and towns as they become more diverse, has had a huge impact on public school systems. How is it being taught differently between California and Texas?
So in California, it's quite clear from the textbooks and from the state standards that the sort of suburban dream of the 1950s was not equally accessible to all people, that because of policies like redlining and restrictive deeds, African Americans in many cases could not move to the suburbs. That entire story of housing discrimination is completely absent from the Texas textbooks. The Texas state standards never mention the word housing. It appears something like 19 times in the California state standards. So if you pick up a Texas American history textbook, you're going to read a very positive story of the baby boom and suburban expansion during the 1950s, and the idea that people just wanted more space and they wanted to get away from crime and congestion in the cities. But you're never going to see that in many cases, white folks were fleeing diversity, and you're not going to hear about, the actual policies that discriminated against African American homebuyers.
There's also some shading, if you will, in how civil rights are taught, specifically white resistance to it, and some of the reasons. I was sort of fascinated that Texas adds a few addendums to California's explanation of why white Americans may have been opposed to civil rights.
Right. In the section on Reconstruction in one book, Texas sort of adds, well, sure, white people resisted Black civil rights, but they also didn't want to pay higher taxes. And expanding education, for example, was expensive. So they're kind of at pains to add that idea that resistance to public spending was independent from racism, whereas I think my own study of history would suggest that those two ideas are sort of intimately linked and can't really be pried apart in that way. Lynchings is another example. Both California and Texas books will say that breaches of racial etiquette, quote unquote, caused lynching. So, for example, a Black man whistles at a white woman. But California will then go further, use the example of a specific, incidences of white violence to show that the perpetrators of white violence often wanted to burn Black businesses, destroy Black economic power, destroy Blacks' ability to vote. So again, it's a slightly more nuanced portrayal in California as to why did these lynchings take place.
And there was another example, and there's so many of them, but one that stuck with me was talking about immigration. So in the California textbook, it seemed to be emphasizing how immigration impacts individuals and families. And there was an excerpt from a novel about a Dominican American family. And then on the flip side, you had Texas, which seemed to be focusing more on how immigration changes broader communities and concerns about safety.
Both the California and Texas version of this book and their chapter on recent debates over immigration with primary sources for students to read. And Texas chooses in that place to highlight the voice of a Border Patrol agent who speaks about the risks from drug trafficking and says that he believes there'll be social upheaval if, there's allowed to be open borders. So there's obviously a strong editorial choice there to include that voice. At the time that the book was published, Texas state standards called for students to debate both legal and illegal immigration. That was the terminology used. So it's no great mystery why the publisher put this Border Patrol agent into the Texas book. I will say that I think it would be a great lesson to read the Border Patrol narrative alongside the excerpt from the novel about the Dominican American family. I mean, that seems like a great activity, but that's not what these books provide. It's something different in California than what's in Texas.
Okay, so you know what my takeaway also was from this? You've got to actually read the text. You can't just take the headline that one used a novel and one used a Border Patrol agent, because when you read the Border Patrol agent's statement, it's not wholly unsympathetic
Right.
to the immigrant that he's been charged with chasing down. In fact, it's rather poignant.
Yeah.
He describes at one point that he falls down and someone comes back to help him, someone he had been chasing. That to me was extremely powerful. So I think this was also a good lesson about how these textbooks can get turned into sort of like these headlines of look what they did. But if you actually go and read the text, it's more nuanced.
And I just want to say this is why it was so important to us when we did this project to actually show the pages side by side. It's exactly for the reason you said. I would have no problem with my daughter reading that Border Patrol narrative. I would want it to be balanced by other perspectives as well, immigrant perspectives. But I think that Border Patrol narrative is actually really nuanced, and there's a lot going on in that.
We're talking with Jana Goldstein of the New York Times about her reporting on history textbooks, what's in them, and who decides. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And while we're talking about classroom resources, curriculum, and instruction, I want to mention we have a new reporter guide on the EWA website looking at open education resources, how teachers are finding and using them, both at the K-12 and the higher education level, and some smart questions for reporters to ask when covering this important issue. You can look for that at ewa.org. Jana, the project is not only fascinating, but it's absolutely beautiful to scroll through these pages of these textbooks. We want to give a shout out to your colleague at the New York Times, Adriana Ramick, who led the design. I'm curious, as a reporter there, how much input do you get on that phase of things?
This was really a collaborative process in every way, and we're just so lucky at the Times to have this wonderful interactive design and graphics team. And then also we had a fantastic print designer who created a very beautiful presentation of this in the print paper. I had this massive reporting. We reviewed over 6,000 pages of textbooks. Myself and another reporter on the national desk read those books together. We had the findings. We knew what the differences were between the states, and we knew we wanted to show them in some ways, but it really wasn't until Adriana came into the conversation that we figured out how to do this. I mean, she was so crucial. I can't say enough about how wonderful it was to work with her. She's the one who came up with this idea that, for each of the major themes, we were going to have one big spread that would allow readers to really look at the pages side by side. And then we would have these smaller takeaways where we would show a small snapshot of the pages. So she was just brilliant to work with. And, together we came up with the idea that when you first come to the piece, you're right immersed in it right away with that image of the Bill of Rights. So yeah, it was truly a collaborative process. There were many people in the room, editors, designers, reporters, everybody came together on this one.
What was a hurdle that you ran into when you were coming up with this project, and how did you get over it?
The first hurdle was getting the books on my desk. Not all the publishers were eager to send their books. And so sometimes it was multiple phone calls or emails to convince them to send the books to me. I think I ultimately had to argue pretty forcefully in some cases that these are taxpayer-funded documents and ought to be available for public scrutiny. And if they weren't willing to share the recent editions of the books with me, I'd of course be able to obtain them by other means. But ultimately, I would also be reporting on the fact that they weren't going to share the books with me. So that was one challenge. And when I started out, I was looking for books from a very broad array of states. So going to the publishers was the most efficient way in the end to get them. And I think, other challenges were just getting through the reading. It was most of the month of September for me just to read the pages, and it was very tiring. But I found that I kind of capped out at 3 or 4 hours of the work in a day, and then I had to put it aside and work on something else.
There were a lot of dramatic examples provided in your project, but I'm wondering, was there anything you came across in these differences in these textbooks or how something was being presented or left out that really surprised you?
I think it was really striking to see the utter absence of discussion of racial discrimination in housing in the Texas books. It seems so relevant to our current conversation around so many issues, whether it's school segregation or poverty more in general, sort of racial divisions in our society. It just seems surprising that in 2020, this kind of stereotypical or cliche version of the suburbanization of the United States is still being taught anywhere, let alone in one of the biggest states in the country.
On the flip side of that, was there something you thought that these textbooks are doing particularly well or a place where they've shown a lot of growth or improvement?
Yes. So thank you for asking that. I think the books on the whole have shown a lot of improvement from when I was in high school 20 years ago. So, for example, there was just a much greater emphasis on the displacement of Native Americans and on how violent and traumatic that displacement was. It didn't feel relegated to like a separate chapter, but it felt that it was all there through the story of the westward expansion of the United States. So this notion of manifest destiny was much more critiqued in both the Texas and California books. I've noted in some of the writing I've done about the project that I didn't learn about boarding schools for Native American children until I went to college. So these were the boarding schools where Native American children were wrenched away from their tribes and their families and subjected to forced cultural assimilation by the federal government. And so these books all contained information on those boarding schools. So that's one area of growth. The California books are really on the cutting edge on LGBTQ history. That was a very big theme of this project. So, for example, even to the point of talking to students about the first sex reassignment surgeries in the early 1950s, that's very cutting edge, that stuff like that would be considered appropriate for teenagers. So I think we're in a time in our broader contemporary culture where people are questioning history and wanting to make history more inclusive. And I saw that to a greater extent in the California books, but both states demonstrated evidence of, some rapid changes in how history is being told.
If I'm a local reporter and I want to follow your lead, where do I start?
Well, I think that while a comparison between different types of instructional materials may not work in a local reporting context, it could. I mean, you could take a look at instructional materials used in your district and find out how much they differ or are the same as, national versions of instructional materials or maybe things used in a neighboring state. And I think it's also a good reminder that classroom materials are just a rich area for exploration. One of the inspirations for this project was I noticed on Twitter over the past few years, bad worksheets and bad assignments from teachers, very often racist worksheets and racist assignments were kind of going viral. So a lot of this is, stuff material that some rogue teacher just comes up with on their own or pulls off Pinterest or something like that. But this entire space needs more transparency and is very rich for reporters to look at.
I agree. And I would love for local reporters to ask teachers how much freedom do they feel they have in their classrooms, how much autonomy to go out and look for those open resources, to look for those primary sources, to deviate, if you will, from the textbook. I think that could be a really interesting question.
Yeah, that is a very good point. And especially because in the social studies teaching profession right now, the whole emphasis is on primary sources. But you then need to ask the follow-up question, which is like, where do you get the idea of what primary sources to pull? Because many teachers will say, well, in the textbook or in the state standards. And so then once you get the idea of, say, which writer you want to go find, a speech they gave or an article they wrote from the 19th century, where do you go to look for that? How do you know that it's real? How do you know it's quality? So these are all questions that you can be asking.
So there's been tremendous response to this project. What are you hearing from teachers?
Well, I'm hearing from a lot of teachers that the project inspires them to teach historiography more explicitly with their students. So to actually maybe bring some of this material into the classroom and show students how ideology can influence the writing of history, show students, maybe two different types of historical writing and ask them to compare and contrast how the same subject like suburbanization is dealt with differently. So we were absolutely thrilled to get that response from teachers. And in fact, our New York Times Learning Network has created a sample lesson plan that includes some of those concepts for any teachers that might be listening to this.
Have you heard from any students?
Yes, we've heard a lot of college students kind of reflecting back on what they learned in these two states or other states over the past few years and what they wish they had learned more of or what they were surprised to learn when they got to college that they didn't learn in high school. That's been a very typical response. By the way, people of all ages have been responding in that way. I mean, the pieces, I think it's opening up so many conversations because it's offering people a chance to kind of recollect maybe stuff they haven't thought about even for decades about what they learned about American history.
So if last year's project in Michigan led you here, what's next?
Well, I think because this is a presidential election year in 2020, we're going to be keeping this focus on how politics comes into the classroom. And I'm not really sure right now where that's going to take me, but hopefully across the country, maybe to some swing states, and really see how schools and educators are sort of responding to this political moment in American history.
Jana Goldstein is a national correspondent for the New York Times covering education, and she joined us from her office there. Jana, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.